Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. John Lee, a professor of ancient history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In this episode, we discuss why the Persian Wars weren't his entry point into Achaemenid studies, how having a PhD student from Iran both enhances and challenges him as an educator, the personal and family relationships between Greece and Persia, and his freedom to design courses at a smaller institution. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I've been really excited about this conversation, and I want to ease you right into it by asking you, how did you get your start in ancient studies? What first drew you to the ancient world?
Oh, thanks for Lexie. First of all, let me say good morning from UC Santa Barbara. It's really delightful to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to have this chance to talk with you. So how did I get my start in ancient studies? I grew up in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, in high school, you take Chinese history, Japanese history, Indian history, British literature for some reason, and Hawaiian history, but you do not take ancient history, Greece or Rome. And so I knew nothing about the ancient world, whether it was the world of the Mediterranean or the world of ancient Persia. And then I got to college at the University of Washington, and I wanted to be a diplomat like my dad had been. So I thought I'll study history. But to be a history major, you have to take one of those required surveys on the ancient world. And that was the first I'd ever heard about Athens or Sparta or Rome or Persia peripherally at that time. That was in the late 1980s. And I was hooked because it was new and different and exotic. And I went on from there. But it was really a general education course at the University of Washington that got me started.
Oh, that's awesome. So when you did find this interest, did you immediately notice that you gravitated toward like a certain area, subject, or were you kind of just overwhelmed by, oh, there's so much here, I have no idea what I want to do?
You know, because it was new, I was overwhelmed at first, and I took every course that I could in the history and classics departments at University of Washington, which was both Roman history and Greek history. And then I began to find that Greek history interested me more, I think because there was a lot of history of warfare, and warfare was a topic that interested me, as it does for many young undergraduates. So I found myself being drawn more in the Greek history direction. And then one of my professors said, why don't you take languages? So that was my beginning of Latin first and then Greek. And by the time I got to being in my senior year, the professor who had become my mentor really suggested, why don't you think about graduate school, John? And I had no idea what that was. So I applied and applied to the places that she suggested and went on from there. But really at first it was both. And as time went by, I narrowed down to Greek history and really to the classical Greek world at first.
Nice. And so now, once you got to grad school, again, how did you choose what you wanted to focus on? Like, by then, had you kind of figured out, okay, yeah, I want to do like this or that, or was it still a process?
It was still a process. I mean, I came to graduate school interested in classical Greece, also in archaeology as well as history. And I ended up, after the usual round of coursework, including a lot of Roman history still. I read a lot of Tacitus. I had some very, very good Roman history seminars. But eventually my dissertation led me to Xenophon and Xenophon's Anabasis, which was a great source for the questions that interested me, which was warfare, but not only the weapons and tactics, but the everyday life of soldiers. So that became my dissertation, which became my first book, Soldiers and Survival in Xenophon's Anabasis. But that I would say my graduate training was really very still Greece and Rome focused. I keep mentioning the Latin, and I land upon that because these days I do very, very little Roman history except when teaching or maybe serving on a committee for one of my colleagues. But my training was different from what I focus on now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, it's I'm glad that you're kind of stressing, right, that what your background is mirrors what a lot of people who eventually end up doing Iranian studies or something to do with Persia, even if it's not in Iranian studies, what they, how they had to start. You have to start in classics, which is kind of unfortunate, but there isn't really a better way to do that as of now. And so, did you get to take classes on Persia at all? Or is this something you had to very much sort of find on your own because there just wasn't anything?
Yeah, terrific question. And absolutely not. I never took in graduate school any course which specifically focused on Achaemenid history or even on ancient Iran more broadly. And even the courses I was a teaching assistant for, where you might mention the Arsacids or the Sasanians, but there wasn't any real component to that. And I think that reflects the times that I was in graduate school, in the early to middle 1990s. That's a quarter century or more ago, we can say. And so I think I followed a train that some of the leading specialists in Achaemenid history, Christopher Tuplin, Pierre Briand, I think even others, came from an angle where their original training or interest came from the classical side. And then as my interests expanded, I became more and more aware of the need to know more about the Achaemenid Empire. I mean, I mentioned, I wrote a dissertation about Xenophon. As that became a book, I really had to learn more about the empire. And as I finished the book, I began to think, well, what about the rest of the empire beyond, the few years that I focus on in this book? And so my interest came, I think, in line with others. You might have folks on this podcast who have the same kind of development where they don't begin in Iranian studies as such, but their other interests lead them into the field. And that was my path. And I think it tells us something about the nature of Achaemenid history or Achaemenid studies, is that it's very broad and it draws people not just in my fashion from the classical side, but also from biblical studies, from Assyriology, Near Eastern studies, from Central Asia and elsewhere. It's really kind of a nexus where people come from elsewhere and they find a new scholarly world.
Yeah, and it's kind of exciting, right? Just because I don't love how you have to sort of approach it from a different field, but I do like the end result because then you get all these different perspectives from other, regions and sort of, okay, so let's synthesize what happens when, it makes for really interesting contributions. And that is something that I do appreciate in this situation where we can't just say, yes, go study that. Here you go. So, in terms of getting into Achaemenid studies, I don't know why, but I kind of assume that people get into it because of the Persian Wars and stuff. Now, was that your entry point? Was that your, what drew you? Or were you actually one of the people who concentrated on something else and sort of see that as yeah, that's a thing that happens. Yes, we study it, but also, hey, there's more.
I would say the Persian Wars, yes, interested me, but it was really the story that Xenophon recounts of the competition between two members of the Achaemenid royal family. It was much more what drew me in. So a century later, and I think I broadened out from there because I became interested in the wider social, economic, and cultural aspects of the empire. And then I was able to expand that by focusing for years on the western coast of Anatolia, what is modern day Turkey, where I spent a lot of years traveling up and down the coast there. So it wasn't the Greek and Persian Wars of the early 5th century that was my thing. It was Cyrus and Artaxerxes, and it was the region of Ionia and its neighbors, this sort of borderlands area between Greece and Persia that really got me interested. And maybe to throw in something else to our conversation, the question of travel, right? Where you can travel. In my training as a historian of Greece, I traveled all throughout Greece. As a professor, I've led travel study trips in Greece and in Turkey. And so that kind of ability to go and see the material, see the place is really important. And obviously, being an American in the 90s and the 2000s, going to Iran is not an option the same kind of way. I know people do that, but I have not been able to. So it's a different kind of enterprise in a way to move from a world where you can say, I have been to Sardis, right? I've climbed the Acropolis of Sardis, to not being able to say that I've not been to Persepolis, I've not been to Susa or Pasargadae, or or to say nothing of smaller sites, to say nothing of Babylon or elsewhere. And that's another aspect of it. You have to expand your focus, not just in terms of the field, but in terms of how you approach this empire, because you can't see all of it the way that you can claim you have seen much of the Greek world.
Well, that seems like then it lends well to, I mean, it leaves an opening, right, for maybe people who have access to these sites to do us a solid, come help us out. We can't go, you can go, so let's work together, right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And of course, there are scholars who have traveled, even Americans in Iran in the past, and international scholars as well. I'm very fortunate now to have a new PhD student who is actually from Iran. She finished her MA at the University of Tehran, and she has traveled everywhere. In fact, she has been to every province of Iran. She's been through Iraq, and she brings a really valuable perspective that I'm able to draw on in our conversations. We're talking about cuneiform sources, or we're talking about the Greek sources. She can say, "Oh, I've been there," and that's a really powerful addition to have as part of the conversation. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds fascinating. And I am curious, since you are lucky enough to have a student come directly from Iran. I mean, so like, what is the experience like advising her? And is it like, how different is it from other, American students or Europeans who come and want to study the same thing?
Well, first of all, I should say I have not had very many students over the years, because although we have a pretty vibrant ancient history program, most of the folks are focusing either on Roman history, late antiquity, or on imperial China. So I tend to be a committee member rather than a chair. I did have a Canadian student who wrote a great dissertation on bows and spears in the Achaemenid Empire, and he happened to be he is also an outdoors person. So he actually was building and testing a replica Garon shield, one of the shields that shows up in our sources. That was part of his dissertation. So I haven't had many students. I mentioned that student because I guess I've had several international students, but having a student from Iran, first of all, is a challenge in the application process. We started corresponding I guess it was September of 2022, and around the time that the protest movements were beginning in Iran. And so for a while we couldn't even converse by Zoom. So that was a challenge. And then finding funding for a graduate student is difficult. You're in the University of California system. You know that we're a public university, and resources can be tough. And UCSB is the smaller sibling, I guess, UCLA. So resources are even tougher. So I was very, very, very pleased when my student was not only admitted but received a full funding package, which enabled her to be here. And so working with a student who has come from Iran and brings a deep preparation there and a deep geographical and topographical knowledge is just really exciting, because it adds so much that I don't have. I mean, when we're having a seminar discussions, oftentimes I'm in the position of being as much a learner as a professor. But on the other hand, it's very interesting that her preparation in Iran didn't include much Greek history. So, back to where we began our conversation here, that's something that I can bring because of the direction that I came from. So I think it's a really positive mixture to have with a student. It's just so exciting to have a student. I love talking with students about ancient history, whatever they're studying, whether it's late antiquity or early imperial China, and I love that. But it's really, really special to be able to talk very deeply about research material in the field that you love the most, and there's something very rewarding about that aspect of graduate teaching.
That's so wonderful. And I'm not going to sit here and assume, right, that every student's background and everyone's experience is the same. Obviously, they're not. But just from this unique example that you've provided, I'm curious, so for the language background, obviously, depending on what education system you've come from and what people place emphasis on, what kind of language background did your student come in with? And does it sort of mirror what here sort of in the quote unquote Western world, we expect of someone who wants to go in and study these fields?
Yes, her preparation does mirror what my preparation was, in the sense that she's now in first year Greek and did not have. So that's very interesting, right? Because we still need the Greek literary sources. We need to look at them. But on the other hand, she has fluent Arabic and she has worked directly with Old Persian material. She has a Middle Persian as well, and has worked with that epigraphical material as well. So in a way, it's sort of a mirror. She came with very different preparation than what I had for graduate school. And the Arabic sources, for example, open up a whole set of materials that I'm really unfamiliar with. The Islamic period historians writing in Arabic, who contain some historical information, however difficult to interpret or muddled it might be, about the Achaemenid Empire. And that's a whole other set of sources that knowing Arabic brings you access to. And we were talking, she was saying, maybe I should learn Aramaic, which would be, that would be a nice research language addition. But maybe the bigger point here is that our old conception of ancient history, the conception I was brought up in of Greek and Latin as the two, that breaks down when you get to the Achaemenid world, because you need a different set of skills. And you also cannot learn every single language. I mean, there are a few people who can learn every single one. And so you become more reliant on cooperation with other scholars, and you have to trust their linguistic skills in publishing documents so that you can use them as a historian. And that's different from the kind of classics-based idea of I am the sole individual who masters all my texts, and it is only I who interpret, right? That makes Achaemenid studies more collaborative in that sense, that people have to acknowledge the limits of their abilities and skills. I mean, it's the rare person who can master every single language needed to study the empire. I know that's a long stretch away from the question you asked, but I think it's in there somewhere. I mean, what do we ask students to learn these days? It's different from what Achaemenid studies makes it possible to think about different ways of learning about the past that our older models didn't really think about.
No, I would agree completely. I mean, it is a different way of thinking. You have to approach things differently, especially when you're going to go into something quite, a bit more interdisciplinary. And yeah, you just look at sort of the available things that you can either study or go into. And I mean, I don't think either you or I are going to sit here and say, oh, yes, Roman history, we're missing so much. It's so hard. We can't just silo ourselves and only look at, one specific area. That would be so easy. And there are definitely many fields where you can't do that. We don't have a corpus as large as all of the Roman sources that I could literally pull off a bookshelf and be like, study this. So no, I think yeah, that's something to definitely think about. Now, I want to pivot us a little bit, and so you mentioned it before that you were interested in ancient warfare, but obviously it's not just the actual war battle tactic strategy part. You were looking also at the daily lives of soldiers, which is a different type of study within warfare. And so I find it interesting. So when looking at that, does this interest extend to, so it seems like, that's taking on a very sort of personal relationship-y type of study, right? It's not just war. So, how far does this extend? And, is that kind of how you like to look at other aspects of Achaemenid Persia, like the sort of more personal relationships?
Yeah, I think that examining the empire from the perspective of personal relationships, family networks, individual life experience over time. I mean, that's the life experience is something that I use as kind of a lens in my mercenaries book. So I wasn't interested. I mean, yes, it was important to know what weapons they had, but I was also, as a historian, trying to recover something of what the social networks of that army were. And so that kind of interest in everyday life and the interest in human experience, insofar as that we can recover it from the material we have, I think that's followed me into the other research I've done on the Achaemenid Empire. For example, recently, as you know, I was at UCLA for this renewed Achaemenid workshops, and my contribution there focused on intermarriage between Greeks and Persians, and how that sort of intermarriage changes or influences the cultural identity that person in the empire might express. So that's another, it's a different aspect of life experience, right? But being interested in that, being interested in life experience, I think kind of prompts my interest in how does mixed marriage affect ethnic or cultural identity? How does it affect the ability to exercise power or legitimacy in the empire? So yeah, there's a common theme that sort of stretches out from warfare to the more recent research that I've done.
Okay, so this one's a two-parter because you gave me just so much to think about. And I guess I could do them in either order because I do want to give you space to talk about, briefly, recap your presentation for those who are not fortunate enough to either join us on Zoom and watch it or in person. But I guess the first one I want to go with, though, is, do you think the sort of personal social relationship aspect of warfare is understudied? Because I feel like a lot of people who go into warfare are very much into, oh, so I want to see the armor, the materials, I want to see the tactics, I want to see sort of the political side of, the sort of overarching political conflict. So yeah, do you think it's understudied?
I would have said that in 2007 before my book came out, but I hope that my book, which is next 15 years ago, kind of was at the beginning of a broader interest in that. And while there are still many people who just want to do the helmets and the armor, and I think we should acknowledge that that's important, right? For example, there are recent finds of armor at places such as Gordian and Sardis that may shed light on the Achaemenid period soldiers are wearing. So that stuff is important. But I think now there is an increasing awareness of the social and cultural logistical aspects of ancient warfare. You're always going to have the people who just want to look at the helmets, and those studies are valuable in a particular way. But I think there's a broader recognition that warfare is, it's deeply tied to the values of the society. We can see this in the royal inscriptions, of the Persian kings. And we can see it in seal impressions, right? We can see the martial values of the empire in seal impressions. So it's not just the weapons and armor, but it's how warfare helps structure people's idea of everything from the right way to rule an empire to the right way to be, to the right idea of masculinity, right? How to be a man in Persia is conditioned also by the structures of warfare. So I think that in the past 20 years that people have really broadened the ways in which they look at studying the ancient world. Hope I've made this small contribution to that. But there are lots of people who are doing this. Lots of people I think who have really tried to broaden beyond just the helmets and armor.
That's good to hear. I don't know. I mean, just as a sort of quick impression, right? It's just I feel like when I do hear people talking about warfare, it's always the more sort of stereotypical things that you hear of. And so I was just kind of curious as to, why that still is. But it's good to hear that there are other people doing other wonderful things, not beyond that. So, yes, I want to circle back to your paper, your presentation for the Achaemenid workshops that we had here last spring. So for anyone who was not able to join us and who the publication isn't out yet, so they can't read about it quite yet. I don't want to have you represent, but could you recap kind of, so what did you present on, and what is, I suppose, the main takeaway that you would want people to have?
So my presentation, which will be revised as a paper in the Portavoz series, focused on Persian elites in the northwestern corner of the empire, the region that encompassed the satrapal center at Deucalion, and also encompassed the city of Troy, or Ilion, and the region of the Troad. And the particular family that I looked at, the family of the Persian noble Artabazos, who intermarried with a Rhodian woman, is one that had received a lot of attention. And in fact, John Hyland, who you had on your podcast recently, had written a really excellent article talking about Artabazos' family. In my presentation, I tried to push further the idea of changing mixed cultural identities over time, and to show that if in the beginning the idea of imperial Persianness was something that that Darius and his successors put out as the unifying principle of the empire, what it meant to be Persian changed over time to the point that you could have a Persian noble marrying a apparently Greek woman and having children with both Greek and Persian names in a region that was deeply entangled, where you had both Greeks and Persians, for example, going to Troy to do ritual activities there. And I tried in the paper to make comparisons with the evidence we have for mixed relationships in other parts of the empire. We have evidence from papyri in Egypt, and we have evidence from cuneiform tablets in Babylonia. But as anybody who's dealt with that material knows, it's very tricky, right? If someone has a mixed Iranian father's name and a Babylonian personal name, is that evidence of an intermarriage, or is it personal choice? I mean, there are many tricky questions there. So that's a quick outline of what I presented, which was focusing on this borderlands region where you have Greeks and Persians in very close contact with each other, to the point of intermarriage at the very highest levels of the society.
Well, I mean, I remember it being very fascinating. So, I can't wait to see what the finished publication looks like. But yeah, it's interesting also because I think like popular culture has contributed, right, to this idea that Greece and Persia were kind of like innately hostile to each other. And then you have other media things like the 300 films and other things just showing us like how, like trying to tell us that they're really incompatible, right? So do you find that people who really want to come talk to you about this, do they not know, like do they fall into this trap essentially, right, of thinking that Greece and Persia really wouldn't want to have much to do with each other because of the wars and the history? And so do you find that people are surprised about this idea of like, wait, actually there were like intermarriages and all this stuff, and they didn't just hate each other's guts and want nothing to do with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. And if you're talking about people, you mean, for example, my students at UCSB. Many of them arrive in a class, if I'm teaching an Achaemenid history upper division class with 45 or 50 students, they probably have gotten the 300 Spartans viewpoint, unless they're from a Persian or Iranian American family, in which case they've gotten a different viewpoint. And that's one of the really interesting things about teaching Achaemenid history in California. And I think it would be different. It would be different elsewhere, but you get both the very stereotypical presentation, and then, from other students, you get the other side, which is, Cyrus founded modern concepts of human rights and other, another set of stereotypes. And I think that students are, especially the ones who come with the idea that the relationship between Persia and Greece is about warfare and two incompatible cultures, are surprised to see the extent of entanglement and interlinking. And I think it puts Greek history in a very different light. If you no longer think of the Aegean world as the center of classical civilization, but you realize that it is a marginal region, which is struggling to maintain a distinct identity on the edges of this very large and very powerful. And let's face it, an empire is an empire. I mean, the Achaemenids they're not in the business of empire for charity, right? The Greeks are trying to maintain a distinct identity, political independence. It really puts a different spin on all of Greek history to see, we like to use the word decenter, right? To take us away from that, the view that Athens and Sparta are the center of the world. And, getting back to your question, when students see that, they really understand that it's a much more interesting story. And as historians, it then becomes a much more interesting story for them, because the simple stories of, inside and outsider, of civilized and barbarian, these things are really complicated, right? From the Achaemenid perspective, it's the Yauna folks who are the barbarians. They're the outsiders, which turns around the stereotypes they might get from popular culture. So I think students are surprised, and I think they're pleased and interested to learn more about, to learn that there's more than just those stereotypes. So another, aspect that's really, I think, important, not just for students, but anybody who's interested in the Achaemenid Empire, is that this is a historical study that requires really thinking about different kinds of sources. If you do mainstream Greek history, you're going to rely on your narrative authors, Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon. Then you're going to turn to inscriptions and archaeology, of course. But if you're going to look at Greek and Persian interactions, you have to look at multiple sets of different texts. So Persian royal inscriptions as well as Greek inscriptions. You have to consider what the archaeology at the center of the empire might tell you, as well as what the Greek archaeology might tell you. And you have to be able to weigh and balance these different kinds of sources against each other. I mean, the classic thing is going back to your Persian Wars. There's been a debate about Xerxes and Babylon. Evil destroyer of temples, or is that just a Greek myth? And that requires considering and balancing very fundamentally different types of evidence. Cuneiform tablets versus a connected narrative account, and that's good for people because I think it really presses them to have to think with different types of material and to consider different types of historical analysis. And that's actually one thing that's really exciting about teaching Achaemenid history classes. You get to introduce people to a viewpoint they didn't know and to sources that they just had no idea that existed.
I think that's awesome. And especially the time period, I suppose, that you specialize in, but also just out of personal curiosity, I remember being very shocked, right, as a young student in a classics department where we didn't have anyone who really did Persia. And so all of my Persia, information came either later or just through personal research. But I remember being very shocked that one of my favorite people from history, ancient Greek history, I should say, to study in school was always Themistocles. I thought, he's got this great narrative arc. You look at his career, you looked at, being the big savior of Athens and all these cool things. And then when I learned that he was eventually ostracized and then he went, to other places in Greece, but then eventually entered like the service of the Persian king and then died as some like illustrious magistrate, I was like, wait, what? He defeated them. Like they were kind of enemies, right? So for me, that was like mind-blowingly shocking. So do you find that like when teaching this course, there's students who have that same reaction? Like, is there a certain figure from history who also kind of has like a Themistocles like arc that always shocks people?
That's a great question. Maybe when I tell them about Themistocles, yes, Themistocles himself shocks them. So, often students come in with just the stereotype and a broad knowledge, so they're not focused on a single individual, but certainly the process by which people move in and out of the empire. In the case of Themistocles, is one famous example. That certainly does interest them because they have the stereotype they may have received is of this sharp division you're talking about, right? Greeks or Persians, civilized or barbarian, depending on which side of the divide you're standing on. And then the degree of cultural intermixing that you find throughout the empire does really interest them. So it's maybe more the processes they see rather than any particular individual that they focus on is what surprises them when they start to learn more about the empire. And they are also, I think, we talk a lot about how long we have known particular sources. The decipherment of cuneiform in the mid-19th century is really not that far away. And that surprises them. That really does. I think that they're like, really? Oh. And so then they begin to question, well, we've known the Greek sources, basically in a wider sense since the manuscripts were available. They were available. Many of them were available in Byzantium, but as they became more widely available in the Renaissance and early modern period. So they begin to think about, they begin to get surprised by the way in which knowledge of the past has developed. And so that's, that process, I think, gets them maybe more than any one particular individual. I guess because I say so much about Xenophon, they're surprised to know that Xenophon, who, I don't want to be stereotypical because there's a lot of more focus on Xenophon today than there was, but in the stereotypical classics curriculum, right, you don't get to hear about Xenophon. He's left out. He's the inferior. He's too easy. He's the beginning Greek writer. But once students realize that here is a source, a writer not only wrote 15 different works on a huge range of different things, but had the kind of awareness of other cultures that is missing sometimes in stereotypical ideas of what the Greeks were like. They're surprised by that. I would say maybe Herodotus is going to get some of that surprise from as well. But in my classes, because I tend to emphasize Xenophon, no surprise. They are sometimes surprised by the way Xenophon overturns their stereotypes of what ancient Greece was.
Interesting. Well, obviously each university is different, the structure, the way things have to go, but it sounds really cool that you're able to teach, this course on Achaemenid history. And So I'm a little curious just about like the classes that you're able to teach. Like I know obviously for smaller universities and stuff, it's always kind of a need-based thing, but like how much freedom do you have to sort of design your own sort of Achaemenid Persian history courses? Like, do you get to teach just one, or can you like go deeper on certain themes or people or something that would give students a deeper look and not just sort of a cursory overview?
Yes, I have, University of California faculty at UCSB as at UCLA have a great deal of latitude to design courses that the way they want them. And, this circles back to where I came from as a historian who was primarily trained in Greece and Rome. The classes I taught in the year 2000 when I arrived here at UCSB are quite different from the classes that I teach today. I mean, I inherited a sort of 2-quarter Greek history, ends of the Peloponnesian War series, and then I expanded that to cover the Hellenistic world. And then as my interest grew in the way we've been talking about in this conversation, I designed a course on the Eastern Greek world and the Ionian borderlands. So I taught that. And then I began to teach the Achaemenid class as one of my staple courses. And this coming, not winter, but in spring, I'm doing a different take on the Hellenistic world class, which is to talk about the last generation of the Achaemenid Empire. So to think about, in the Hellenistic class, you go conquest of Alexander, poof, we're down somewhere else. But I really want to stay in the period, let's say in the 380s down until 300 or so, like this century of transformation, and to focus on what happens when an empire ends, right? And what changes, what persists, how do people make sense of that transformation? So that's a different kind of class than anything I've taught before, and I have the freedom to do that. And then at the graduate level, because we don't have a huge ancient history program, and here again, anybody's familiar with the UC system will know that we are small, and we don't even have, many of the colleagues that you all are really fortunate to have who work in Near Eastern studies and cuneiform Akkadian, Egyptology, Iranian languages, and I mean, I can go on and on. Like, we don't have that, right? And so we miss out on a lot of that. And maybe this is a good place for me to plug how valuable Portavood has been for me and my students, because back in the day before Zoom, I would drive down, but Zoom, especially in the pandemic, and especially now that, it's lovely to go to UCLA for in person. I love doing that, but for students, they can't always do it. I mean, Portavood it's a big resource for being able to teach some of the things that I teach. I assign lectures from that lecture archive for students to view and to write reactions about. When the conference was being Zoomed, I assigned that. They had to choose several sessions to go to. And, that all ties into your question about what can I teach. I can have the freedom to do that, and fortunately have the resources like that Portavood offers, even though we don't have those here. It's my dream that we have a colleague who does the first millennium BC in Babylonian cuneiform culture. Anybody's listening out there and doing hiring plans, but until that day comes that I have those sorts of colleagues here. Of course, I do have a great Egyptology colleague in addition to the Chinese and Roman colleagues I've mentioned. Having that ability to draw on the resources that you all offer, I mean, that's important for for a campus like UCSB. So yeah, I've gone a long way from your question about teaching. Maybe this shows how excited I am. Maybe the last thing I'd say about teaching is that the students, they get so excited when they begin to learn a vision of the ancient world that they hadn't known about before. And even though ancient Persia is part of the California middle school standards, the sense I get is that many students really have not had any exposure to it before they get to college. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to add that to their understanding of world history.
Yeah, well, I mean, I loved the previous answer. I really did so much because, that kind of was going to be a follow-up anyway. So you've half answered it. Now you can just add to it if you would like. But, this is something that, I think is recognized, but we don't always talk about, which is, for the smaller schools that aren't as lucky to be a UCLA. I went to the University of Missouri for undergrad. We didn't have any resources. And like the year after I graduated, my department essentially got shoved in with 2 others and rolled into, one. So it's an issue that I think we're doing a better job of like not tiptoeing around it. But yeah, for smaller institutions who just like don't have these resources, I think a big question is like just short of hiring new people and being able to fix something at that institution, like what is something that we can think about getting or doing that would help sort of offset this? So you mentioned the Portavuta Institute being able to like provide resources to help you craft the classes you teach and provide resources for assignments, but like, is that enough? Like, should we be doing more? And not just we as Portavuta. I'm just like anyone who does either Iranian studies or just some people who have more resources. Like, how can we help smaller institutions?
That's a great question, and it gets to how the University of California works together as a system. And I think we already do. In addition to UCLA, I mentioned Irvine and Riverside, which also have really important faculty who contribute to Iranian studies more broadly. And I mean, if we think about it, that's something that kind of distinguishes California in the United States. And so, a UC system-wide approach where we recognize that, in the context of each of our own schools, we may be limited or at the margins of interest. But when we look at the system together, we have a great deal of expertise, and it's an expertise which is unusual when you look across the United States, and especially in conjunction with the fact that you have many Persian or Iranian Americans in California. So I don't know what to. I don't want to suggest a program right now of what to do, but certainly working together across our different universities is one way that we can continue what people have already been doing. I think that more of that, that's promising for the future. Zoom, the ability to take courses by Zoom also for example, students who need graduate language training. I mean, that would be a potential possibility to think about for the future. We used to have a student years ago. She drove from here to Berkeley for the day to take a class, then she would drive back. That was pre-Zoom. And yeah, nobody does that anymore. But although in-person instruction is always, to me, preferable, I mean, the ability to take a course at another campus and do so remotely, I think that's something that could enhance the collaborative work we do together. So, but these are very, very big ideas, and it would takes more planning and time to think about how to make those realities. I mean, for the moment, I'm very glad that I have good relations and contacts with other people who do ancient history broadly across the UC system, and I think that's one of the it's a really nice thing about being in California and having these UC system colleagues is that you have a network of people that you can communicate with and share ideas with, participate in events such as at UCLA, or invite people to come and speak at your institution in person. So they build up those in-person connections.
Yeah, well, the question is meant to be open-ended because obviously if we had this answer, we wouldn't be talking about it. It would be done, or we would be trying to do it. But it's interesting to think because obviously you have research centers like Portavuta that provide accurate, good information that can be used in a lot of different scholarly settings. But then you do have, right, a lot of other corners that are like quote unquote content producers. Now, as to their accuracy, that can be debated. But, I think often one of the things that I routinely find myself thinking about as someone who really likes reception studies, reception of the ancient world, not just ancient Greece and Rome, is, I mention it time and again, but it's very problematic that the 300 films are like one of the only major things we have to teach and talk about ancient Persia. And again, it's very centered on Greece. So it's like, man, it'd be so nice to have other content producers who would maybe help but not give us something like that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It would, and from the other end of the empire, there is a recent Kazakh movie on Tomiris, which actually John Hyland, who spoke again on your podcast, clued me into. And Tomiris is very interesting because it is a kind of a Kazakh mirror of 300 in some ways. I think it's a better film, but again, it's one in which the Persians come off as the outsiders. It's nothing like 300, and you're right that it's unfortunate that 300, another California product, right, it retains quite a bit of cultural power, even all these years. I mean, what is that, 2006 or 7, and we're talking about years after its production, it retains a lot of popular cultural power. And yeah, I mean, I hope that we'll have more, some more balanced and more attractive popular culture representation, movie or something that draws on. I mean, think of, I don't know, just to brainstorm wildly, the Chalamet is inspiration, potential inspiration for all sorts of film. And I know some of that has been done at a smaller level, but not as far as I know, at a Hollywood level. My students often ask me, how come there's no Xenophon movie, right? And I don't know, it'd be very difficult to get the full complexities of between Greece and Persia into a movie. But that's, there's, if you're out there, Hollywood producers, think about a Xenophon movie, which is not just a stereotype of the manly Greeks, but something that talks about being between, and the links that you and I have been talking about today. Yeah. Maybe as more students have an exposure in college to the modern historical understanding of the Achaemenids and to the variety of sources and the variety of perspectives, someday, somehow that may make its way into a Hollywood production.
I mean, there's so much there. I perpetually don't understand why we don't. We are talking about so many different figures in history from the Persian side who would make for an interesting subject of, like, I always complain bitterly, right, that I'm like, I want like a HBO Rome or Game of Thrones type of thing on the life of Themistocles, because I think that would be really cool. But I'm like, you could easily make a Game of Thrones type of HBO series on Cyrus, on Xerxes, Artaxerxes. Like, you could do so much, right? So it's frustrating that we have so much great material just sitting here and nothing's done with it beyond just academics use it, but for some reason Hollywood is still kind of not there. But the reason I just wanted to bring up 300 was because, as someone who actually studies war and stuff, so does it bother you? Like, specifically, does that bother you beyond just the sort of problematic everything else? But someone focusing on war, I'm always like, I have to ask the people who do war stuff. Like, what?
Well, yes, because for the frustrations we're talking about, that it promotes a mythologized and inaccurate view of the past, and specifically of warfare. The Spartan army becomes this sort of hard-bodied, it's like best I can say, live in California. It's a very Southern California image, right? Whereas the Spartan army we know through the sources is a very different, different sort of thing. Certainly physically, emphasis on physical strength, but it's not about this individual warrior prowess that you see in that movie, right? It's about being part of a group. It's about relationships between men, which are very close and include sexual relations. Whereas in the movies, if it's not omitted at all, it's denigrated. It's been so long since I've seen the movie. So kind of mythologized modern Sparta, which has little to do with the realities of ancient Sparta, to say nothing about, the way in which the opposing warriors are presented. The Persian army they're literally faceless, or they're wearing stylized kind of stereotypical Asian masks. It's just a jumble of Orientalist stereotypes. So yeah, at a bunch of different levels, and they're two, right? The two movies, those are really, yeah, I think is the best way to say it. I mean, in the second movie, there's a scene where the Spartan navy comes rowing to the rescue of the Athenian fleet. And, if a 5th century Athenian audience had seen that, they would have just hooted in derision, because everybody in antiquity was very clear that it was the Athenians who were the professionals, and the Spartans they could barely keep oars from getting entangled at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, for example. But yes, I mean, we could go on and on, but I think maybe the bigger point to get out of this is movies like this, and even more recent documentaries, show that certain narratives become ingrained in popular culture, and it's just hard to get away from them because they're convenient and easy. And if you're a producer looking to tell a story, well, I just go back to the same old story, because you'll know that your audience is familiar with that mythologized story. And so when we talk about, what about a movie about Cambyses? I don't want to do Cyrus, because Cyrus has his own mythology around him, but Cyrus's son Cambyses, what a movie about Cambyses would require, introducing Cambyses into a broader popular culture context. I think that would be harder. And so, I mean, we have some sympathy for the pop culture, producer in a way, because they have to work within the limits of what you can. I mean, what you can do in a popular culture production. Yeah, this you're raising a really interesting set of questions. And again, we can only hope that that's one thing university educations are supposed to do, is to broaden people's minds, and that whether they learn about ancient Iran in the 1 or 2 lectures I give them in a survey class, or the entire quarter that they have when they take my upper division class, that over time that change what the popular knowledge, the popular narrative is. I mean, that's, as a teacher, I hope that I hope that will occur.
Well, I mean, in terms of changing the narratives and helping get more information out there, now we have the upcoming Society for Classical Studies / Archaeological Institute of America annual meeting coming up in January, and I see that you're doing a panel on Persia. So can you give us a little hint as to what you will be presenting on there?
Yes, I'm blanking on the title of the overall panel, but it's something, I think, recentering ancient imperialism. And my particular contribution is going to be actually about many of the things we've talked about today, which is about teaching Achaemenid imperialism. And one of the things I do is I draw on 19th century textbooks from the beginnings of college and university textbooks in the 1880s, and then compare how portrayals of the empire have changed up into the 21st century. And it's very interesting to see how, some early textbooks had a very positive portrayal of the Persians, because they were writing from a Christian viewpoint, where Cyrus was seen as the protector, liberator of the Jews, and therefore as kind of a precursor to Christianity. And then in the 20th century, you get the Orientalist stereotypes of the effeminate, decadent, weak, degenerate empire. And that lasts almost, until the end of the 20th century, when you see textbooks start to present a more balanced picture. So one of the things that my presentation will do is talk about how we teach the nature of this empire, and particularly imperialism. And, it gets again to the Greeks versus Persians. If before the stereotype was Greeks good, Persians bad and degenerate, the turn on the other side is Greeks are terrible and Persians are this loving empire. There was a World Civ textbook a couple of years ago that actually said it was considered an honor to bring tribute, to Persepolis. Now, maybe for the individuals, but the other side of this is we have to be clear that the Achaemenid Empire was an empire, like the Roman Empire, like any other empire, and that empires work by extracting resources and labor for the benefit of the people on top. And so we have to look at this as historians, rather than kind of create this value judgment of one side good, other side bad. And so that's something that I will try to address in the paper. That's a lot for 20 minutes, but so that just give you a kind of a preview of what I hope my contribution will be. And there are some other very prominent scholars on there. And so I think as a whole, I hope that panel will introduce new perspectives on the Achaemenids to a classics conference. And again, we're circling back to the beginning. I'm not sure how much new perceptions about the Achaemenids or ancient Iran more broadly have made their way into classics. It'd be nice to see even more connections.
Yeah, well, I plan to be there, so hopefully I will get to see I hope that there's going to be good interaction with the scholars who show up to see the presentations, and I hope it really gets people thinking, because I think it's long overdue. We should be talking about this and decentering the classical world, specifically Greece and Rome. We'll see what the reception is at a classics conference, right? So that is okay.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map, or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
Well, there are 2 questions that I normally use to end the podcast. And the first one is, what do you believe is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Boy, from ancient Persia, from the Achaemenid world most particularly, how about a vision of a world power that is diverse and multicultural? Even though the empire only lasts for 2 centuries, I think people still look back to it in that respect. You could look at some specific aspects, for example, the widespread distribution of Aramaic. That would be one thing to look at. And its ability to cross cultures that might at first seem totally opposed. So we've been talking throughout this conversation about Greece and Persia, right? So one of the legacies of ancient Persia is it gets us thinking about the connections between peoples, not just Persians and Greeks, but Persians and Egyptians, Persians and Babylonians, Persians and Central Asians, Persians and developing identity of the Jewish people. And so the legacy of connections, I think, is a really big one for us to consider.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. Well, and then the last question I have for you is, what do you think would be the best legacy that we ourselves can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
Well, these are very deep questions. The best legacy that we can leave ourselves is to, I think, be the best teachers we can to introduce people in the best possible way to material that they may not have experienced before, and to be the best researchers we can, not only in the sense of our individual selves, but in the sense of working together. I mean, of cooperating with one another to advance the study of a field, which has long been recognized, an empire that's long been recognized, but has really emerged, recent generations as a field, so that it eventually will be the case that no university history department would consider having a position that didn't think about the history of ancient Iran. That would be like a standard position to have. So that sort of teaching and research, I think, it's something that we can all work on together. And maybe the corollary of that is we can change that popular narrative that you kept asking about.
Yeah, no, I would agree. That'd be great. I would love it if, history, ancient history, classics departments everywhere had like a dedicated expert for ancient Persia. That would be so cool, because then anyone who wanted to take classes on it would have the freedom to. So that would be so lovely. So I did kind of lie. There is one last question I'm going to ask, and that is, hopefully it'll be very simple and easy, but it is, where can people find you if they would like to send you an email, ask a question, find your research publications, any other media appearances you've done?
Yes, if you want to simply do an internet search for John Lee, John, and Lee, Lee, UCSB History, my UCSB History webpage will pop up with links to my research, some things that are available for download on PDF. If you're interested in hearing my teaching, I have done a 12-hour lecture series for the great courses on Achaemenid Persia, and that is, if you wanted to learn more, that's my contribution to teaching for a broader audience. And you can also find a link from that for more information about that on my UCSB History website. So I guess the answer is go to the UCSB History website, look for John Lee.
Sounds good. Well, we'll make sure to link that in the show notes so people can go and find you and read all of your cool work. And I just want to say, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you this morning, and I hope that you will come back and join us at some point in the future.
Thank you, Lexie. This has really been an enjoyable and very, very wide-ranging conversation. I'm really grateful to have the chance to talk with you. So thank you.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexie Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA. or visit our website, portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.